All right, bud.
All right.
Kick us off. And because we can sit here and talk all afternoon, which I like. I mean, I
Oh
like,
yeah, I mean,
like
it's great
Yeah.
that we can all just sit here and talk. The downside to that is it
We
can
got
extend.
business.
Yeah.
We got business. Yeah.
So welcome back to the air and to the area, biggest folks. Again today I have Scott and Eddie, and we are diving into the creation story. If you were with us last week, you got to see an interesting thought process on the on my thoughts into the Trinity being in the first chapter of Genesis. If you missed that, I encourage you to go back and watch it. I will stress again, I am not a scholar. I am not a biblical guru. That is just my thought process. And it was nice to get feedback on that. So, if you've missed that one, I suggest you go watch it. It is a good talk amongst amongst us. But today we are going to dive in and kick off with the creation story. So one of the things that we've talked about in between last week and the intro was there's particularly two sides to the story of Genesis. Is it figurative or is it literal?
Right.
Those are really the two ways that Genesis is looked at, especially the first 11 chapters. That is just I don't know of anyone who can go back and forth because everyone has their set opinions. I think it's literal. I think the 6 creation days and then the day of rest was 6 24-hour days. I don't see why it would be stated there was evening and there was morning the whichever day if it wasn't a literal 24-hour period. Now, I could be completely wrong. I've been wrong before.
Really?
It won't be the last time. But either way you look at it, if it is a 24-hour day or if it's just a metaphor for a period of time. I don't know the specific scripture. Maybe one of y'all will offhand, but a day is like 1,000 years to God. So I think about that, and that in turn brings up another thought in my head about the creation story. It gets into your young Earth versus old Earth theories. My position has changed in the past few years. I make fun of me or whatever. I'm one of those who thinks the Earth is right at around 6,000 years old, give or take 100 or so years. I've got to where in what I read, watch, and study and listen to, I always double check things if it doesn't make sense to me. But I believe that there is enough evidence to prove that creation was right at around 6,000 years ago. I have heard a different theory, which takes me back to a day in the Lord is like 1,000 years. The theory is that the earth is give or take 15,000 years old. That when God created each day, he gave that day versus 1,000 years for time for the earth to age. So it was an aged earth by the time he created man, because there would have been 6,000 years there already. Now, it's a weird theory. It's an interesting theory in my head, but
Well,
I don't know.
That's referred to in that's referred to, when people are talking about it, the day age theory, right?
Right.
So a day
Okay.
is an age. So whatever that defining period of an age would be. So there again, that analogy, a day is like 1,000 years to God, right? Now there again, that statement in and of itself is hyperbolic. So are we supposed to take that as literal, or are we supposed to take that as God really doesn't have I don't want to say a sense of time, but he's not constrained by time, and
Right.
he's not looking at his watch all the time going, yep, this is when I need to do this.
Exactly. Right. And so we work everything we do around time.
Sure.
It's just, and unfortunately, the U.S. is one of the most time constrained countries there is.
Sure.
We feel like we always have to be doing something, moving something, going somewhere.
Right.
Not me. I'm retired.
Well,
No, I go and do a lot, yes, but I'm still time constrained, but
Right.
not as much as when I was working 60 hours a week.
yeah, I
Right.
mean, we think we have to cram so much into a 24-hour period, whereas other countries around the world are more laxed on things. Now,
Sure.
I can't name any of them offhand, but one of the examples I'm going to use is, like I said, I can't name the country offhand. I'll see if I can find it. But when a woman goes on maternity leave, they get paid by the company,
Mm-hmm.
and they're made to take off for X amount of time.
Yeah.
There's countries that require you to take X amount of weeks off throughout the year.
Right.
To whereas the U.S., if a woman wants to take 3 months off to be with her child when it's first born, you have to prepare for that.
Right.
And coming from seeing a wife that with our first two boys could only take 6 weeks off and then was forced to go back to
Right.
work, versus with our third son, we actually put enough aside preparing
Right.
to cover 7 weeks.
Right.
So she could have the full 3 months off.
Right.
And talking with her and seeing that the way I got to see it from that point of view, it's messed up. Now, that's a whole nother conversation, but it wraps around that time premise.
Right. Well, there's several things that we could unpack there. Yes, the
Well, yeah.
industrial revolution did a lot for us, but it also did a lot against us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Iceland, for example, has gone to a 4-day work week. There are nations out there that are trying to do something a little bit different in terms of that. But yeah, your point is correct. We live based on time, and I don't think God does.
No, he's
You know, we're-
he's outside of time. He created
Well,
time
now
as we know it.
there's some philosophical discussion about that because we can talk about God tensed, right? So we can talk about God was, right? And in the Bible, we look at God in a tensed set, right? It's something that happened in the past. Now, whether he exists in time now or not is something that the philosophers are still, beating their heads against because, there again, the concept of time even is something that we know that there's a passing of, right? So we can talk about things as past, present, and future, something that's happening now, or something that was, or something that will be, right?
Okay.
So when we talk about God, we can talk about God in a tensed sense. So there again, if we're speaking in that tensed sense, does now God exist in time? And there again, there's some philosophical discussion about that. That's pretty interesting. I mean, it's it depends on how heady you want to get into things like that. But there is some pretty interesting discussion about just where is God in relationship to time. Now I talk about God being timeless, but what I mean is he's not constrained by time. Right. He's endless. Right.
He is infinity.
Yes. He's eternal. So that's what I mean when I say timeless. I mean that he doesn't have a beginning or an end. Right. He's always going to be. So.
Right.
And I think that makes him outside of time, but he entered into time, created time, but he entered into time with, Jesus had his incarnation.
Right,
And
but I don't think time constrains him
Time
like
does
time.
not- no, I
right,
no,
that
time does
time
not
constrains
constrain
us. Right.
No, he doesn't have to make his train,
No.
at a certain time.
That's what I'm.
Or get on-
He
or get on the
ain't
bus.
looking at his watch. I don't wear a watch
Probably
anymore.
doesn't have a calendar on the
No, he probably doesn't either.
on the on the island at home like what we do. We got this giant calendar, and
Mhm.
everything better be on it.
Yeah, and if not, if
Yeah.
not, my wife gets irritated
Well, mine
if it
does
ain't
too.
if it ain't on the
They
calendar.
probably talk together about
Yeah.
this.
Yeah,
But
but
I see this idea about, was it 15,000 years old? I'm going, and an age to Earth. Why? Did the Earth need to mature?
Right. It's an interesting thought and theory to think about. I don't think that way or necessarily agree with it. I mean, I think that when we look at things and we get into, when God creates the vegetation, it's there. It doesn't have to grow. It doesn't have to take time. He creates it, and it's there. It's ready. It's present.
The waters under the earth, underneath, and all the aquifers and all that stuff. It's
Right. It's
when he made the earth, and
he made it ready.
And I look here, and it says in 26, God said, "Let's make man in our image and our likeness," and so he did,
Mm-hmm.
and it was there. And I think about too, the day is like 1,000 years. People lived a lot longer then, so 1,000 years to them had to still seem like a long time. Even a guy that lived 300 years, he's going, well, that's nothing. I'm 600. But if God created time, space, and relationships, and physics, and all those things, which He did, why would He make a year or a day 1,000 years? I mean, if it's not 24 hours, why would all of physics and all interspatial relationships change? Because we know God's not going, I better tighten that up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't think that through. We don't have any of that kind of stuff. And what was the purpose of the creation of Earth? Which is something we've not really talked about. What was the purpose of it? We know God's not going, well, this is boring, so let's do something else. I just think there's lots of thoughts in there to consider, but in the end, this is where we stand.
Well, okay, so I'm gonna take the other position.
Okay?
Okay.
So I'm going to take the position, and there again, I think I said something about it the last podcast. I think the first 11 chapters of Genesis are more of a polemic. In other words, a written document, although I don't know at the time that it would necessarily have been written, but a prose anyways, whether it was spoken or written, that was essentially speaking out against other gods and other
Right.
religious philosophy that was out there at the time. So now, if you okay, so let me be perfectly clear when I state this. I don't know what this is, and when I say I don't know what this is, I'm saying I can't take something and put a reagent in there and it turns blue,
Mm-hmm.
and I go, oh, that's copper, right? Okay, I can't know like that, right? So everything that I say is more on probabilities or possibilities, right?
Right.
So I'm talking in terms of what's probable or possible. So in my mind, is it possible for God to have done this in 6 days? Yes. He has that power. He has that creative power. And I will give him that credit that he could. Now, I think that this is allegorical. And there's several reasons why I think that. One, would we all agree that we're still in the 7th day? So are we in a day that God rests?
My thought on that would be no.
Okay.
My simple answer is no.
Uh-huh.
And my response to that is when the fall happens, you can see God start to work again to move things and to get things to that time and manner to where Christ would come. God is working throughout that time. Is he creating like he
Right.
did in the beginning? I'm going to say no, because it's all created. But he is still working amongst prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Jonah, different people he's working through,
Mm-hmm.
that he's not just sitting back and going, well, let's see what happens. I think that his day of rest
Was a physical 24-hour period that he said.
theoretically, yes.
To me.
Is that where you stand?
Yeah,
Peter?
yeah, pretty much. Yes, 24 hours.
I think we're still in the 7th day.
And we've got started off with familial units, and that grew, and eventually God said, okay, quit marrying your sister, kind of stuff.
Right.
And we have enough people, but then we needed government, and that developed. Then so God put judges in
Mm-hmm.
that regard, and then we went to, well, we need a king, and we got a king, and that didn't work out as hot as they thought it would. And then we wound up God's plan all along, which is a savior.
Okay, so let me stop you just for a second. So when is God knowing and doing all of these things? So when did he know? Let me give an example. When did he know that he was going to have Moses and he was going to have to intervene in history and part the Red Sea. When did he know that?
From infinity.
Okay, so he knew it before the action happened.
Mhm.
He knew that he was going to have to do that before it happened. Okay, I would agree with you.
From infinity.
So if he knew it before it existed, right? Then he already knew what was going to happen when it happened.
Yes.
So he just knew I needed to intervene here, right?
Well, in his sovereignty, yeah.
Right.
He did, and set everything up.
So he's not in history. So there again, he's not going, wait a minute. Now wait a minute. The Israelites are backed up against the Red Sea. Now what am I going to do?
You got to get the army to go someplace else.
Yeah, wait a minute. I got to put this pillar. I got to put this pillar in front of them. Wait a minute. Now how am I going to get them across the Red Sea?
Shop and have the boys work on it.
Right. No,
he doesn't do that. No.
Right. So okay. So we agree that he knew it before it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
He had a plan for ultimate salvation. He created.
Right.
What was his creative purpose? It was, for me, it was to bring glory to himself.
Sure.
And then the part of the fruit of that is fellowship with us. We're gonna get to be there.
Sure.
And but he had that plan put together. He knew me while I was in the womb.
Mm-hmm.
He knew me before that. And
now, specifically in that verse, specifically he was talking about Jeremiah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically.
Now, we always extrapolate that.
I like to think that he knew me.
Right. And I believe that's true. I believe that God knew me at, well, logically prior to creation. See, I can't say time-wise. I got to say logically prior to creation.
I understand, and
Right.
I agree with the words that you're using in that regard. But it just, I guess there's just something about me that it bothers me. Little things, little quirks. God put all this together. We have eyelashes and eyelids. We have fingers, fingernails. All our inward systems working like they are. But God says we're going to start off with a 1,000-year day. He's already has it broken down, referring to years. So why would you? And I realize we said this in church in Sunday school this morning. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. So get over yourself.
Right. So yeah, I think the other day we agreed that the macro evolution that's sometimes taught in science we don't agree with, and I don't either. Darwinian evolution, I think, is pretty much proved to be, false. So I'm not that kind of evolutionist. If you were gonna say that, although I believe a hard determinist could easily make a case for that if they wanted to, but I don't think any of the three of us from the conversation that we were having last time, or at least the gist that I was getting out of it, that we agreed that macroevolution wasn't a thing.
Correct.
So, but I guess I would ask the question: what do you do with the scientific data? So, scientists who said, well, there was, scientists who thought that the universe from today backwards was infinite, right? But then they came up and said, well, wait a minute. We have this singularity that's out there that when the first trace of the universe that we can have was a big bang, right? So, and they can measure that, and as near as I can feel, that timeline is somewhere near 13.8 billion years ago. Okay, so how do we reconcile that with this?
So one of the things that I've seen and heard because what really turned me on to all this was a documentary called Is Jinn This is History.
Right.
If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's a phenomenal documentary. But the way that the scientists and stuff describe the difference in between carbon 14 and carbon 12, the way it shows up in the things they find,
Right.
there's I don't understand it. I'm not a scientist. It kind of makes sense when they talk about it, but during certain points in times, you actually get more carbon 14 than you should get. So it makes things appear older than and they are. And one of the examples, and I liked, now, how much foundation does it have? I don't know. I haven't dug into it, but they came across some dinosaur bones. Dinosaurs existing is a whole nother story, but we'll bypass that. But they came across some dinosaur bones that still had not live tissue, but had pliable tissue. And the question for that was, tissue, especially pliable tissue, isn't going to last millions of years.
No.
Couple thousand maybe, but not millions.
Right.
So, but the bones and the sediment and all that were coming up with that millions of years, but the pliable tissue was disproving all that.
Right. Right.
And so it's one of those things that, depending on the time and the atmosphere and the situation and this and that, if we're converting more carbon 12 into carbon 14 at some times, that is making stuff appear older than it is, how can we truly trust the numbers we're getting back?
Maybe that's what's wrong with us. We got a lot of carbon 14 in
Maybe
us.
that's it.
Yeah, we're appearing older than we are.
Yeah, because I definitely don't feel as
got
old
more
as.
carbon
yeah.
14 in us.
Well, but I think that there's some to that, and I'm willing to listen to that. But when we're talking about the age of the universe and how they calculate it from the singularity, they're not using carbon 14 to do that. So they're not dating things based on that. So they're dating things based on radio waves, radiation, how far it would take that stuff to travel, and things like that. So it's more of a calculation, which there again, if I get the math wrong, right, I could be messed up.
Well, yeah, because if you're off by a degree, you're off by miles at that point.
Right. So
you got the singularity, that original point of that Big Bang, but humorously, I say, I think there's a song from the 1970s that disproved that. You know what it is? Nothing from nothing leaves nothing.
Yeah.
And it's the 70s, kind of thing, disco, and as bad as that was, but you can't get something from nothing.
Well, let me. Okay, so what I've tried to do through my life is make sure that everything reconciles. And I'm going to fess up. One of my favorite books of the Bible is Romans. I love that. I love that book. Every time I read it, I learn something new. So Paul, and there again, I'm paraphrasing. It's actually in the first chapter, first several verses, actually, of Romans, that we are without excuse for knowing God and the gospel. I mean, he infers that the gospel can be known this way, but that we're without excuse because nature is out there for us to discover and look at
And to see God's
handiwork.
work.
Right.
Yeah.
So my question is how do I reconcile what I'm observing or what I could observe, and there again, because they don't seem to equal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and there again,
Well,
I try to be
and-
open-minded about it and look at all the data, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the data out there? Yeah, we could have some things that carbon-14, carbon-12 argument that there are things that are actually younger than what we think they are. Okay, fine. We found some tissue. Some of that stuff, from what I've read, is suspect at best.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't
right.
know how much foundation that has,
Right.
but it brings up a good point.
Right. There again. So what we're trying to do, not unlike the Greeks in the Areopagus, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're testing one another, right? We're trying to find out. We're trying to among us figure this stuff out. So it just happens to be that I'm the one that's the minority. So I can feel picked on, right?
Well, in today's topic,
Yeah. But there again, I hope everybody knows I don't feel that way, and that I was smiling when I said it. But okay, so how do if you were to convince me? So let's say I was agnostic. I was willing to accept. Yeah, there might be a God, but I got science out here telling me that 13.8 billion years old. We got human. We actually have an archaeological record that shows humans have been around probably 150,000 years. I mean, now not exactly like we are right now, but in some form of homunculus humanoid type form, Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, that kind of thing. That we've been humping it on the earth for a while now. So how do I reconcile that this is 6 days and for rounding purposes 6,000 years ago, right? So how do we reconcile that? Because there again, when I talked about last week that this is a struggle. This is a struggle because I want to believe this is 6 days. I just can't get past that. This seems hyperbolic to me. Right.
And it's that is something that is a great question, and I pray heavily that outside of this setting right here today, that I never have to answer that question. Because I can't articulate the words to explain or express why I think and believe the way I do.
Right. Now there again, I was telling you about the old cowboy.
Yeah.
The last time. Well, why do you say it? Because the Bible says so.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's as far as he wanted to take it, and that's fine. I'm willing. I grant it that yes, this could be God created all of this in 6 days. Now I'll grant that it's a possibility. There again, I don't think that it is. The language is too repetitive, which means that to me it sounds more like it's something that you would want somebody to remember in terms of a story, not history. I mean, if we look at the histories, okay, so let's jump forward a little bit, several thousand years actually.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's discrepancies that we have. Now, not when I say discrepancies, I'm not talking about Luke says that Jesus was crucified upside down, and Matthew says that he was crucified right side up. What I'm talking about is there's discrepancies in the way that they tell that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it was history, I would expect that to find some variations between things between the four Gospels. Matthew has a very Jewish, Hebrew tint. Luke has a very Greek, tint,
Mhm.
right?
And because Luke was a
Right.
physician, right?
Yeah.
And so in between him and Matthew, there's a different educational path.
We
And
have a
so-
different purview.
Exactly.
Right.
And so
Same with John. So if we throw now Mark, Mark looks like Matthew, right?
right. So
He just doesn't say it as wordy as Matthew does sometimes.
and so my response to the difference
So-
in between the four gospels is perspective.
Sure, and I'm willing to say that if I'm looking at it,
Because if they all said the exact same thing the exact same way at the exact same time, I'd question that
Okay.
because it's more than one source.
Okay, so let's take a time out. So let's read, right? So there's a repetition that goes on here, right?
Right.
Okay, there was morning or evening and morning the first day.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well I'm going to have to pause there. Wait a minute. Evening to morning isn't a day. Not
Evening
even-
to morning was the way the Jewish and the Hebrew people did their
Well, it was
their
evening
days.
to evening.
or evening to yeah.
It was evening to evening. So evening to morning isn't a full day. That's a half a day. That's 12 hours. So
Okay.
so
I'll
evening to evening would be a full day, right? So yes, I would agree
Okay,
that
so-
that
Okay.
the Hebrew believed that the day started
At dusk.
at dusk, right? But I still have a complete cycle, right?
So
to get to, I have only a half a cycle. So
That
evening
is
to morning,
true. that
evening to
never
morning
clicked
is
to
only
me.
half of that cycle.
And were they on daylight savings time?
Right, exactly. So do we give an hour or take an hour? Right. So what
We
time
don't
zone?
know.
Well, but we know
don't
what
know.
time zone roughly they were. They were over in the Middle East. So we can figure out the time zone. right?
That stinking Sanhedrin, they can't make up their mind.
That
about
was good. I
stuff.
like
Okay,
Yeah.
but it repeats, right?
it does. So
Okay, so I have something that
I see
rhymes.
that.
I have something that rhymes here. Okay, now there again, when we think about literature and rhyming, we think about, there once was a man from Nantucket, right? Okay, so I'll stop that one there, right? So we think about that sing-songy rhyming
Mhm.
thing. Well, that's not how the writers of the Bible rhymed. They rhymed by repeating things because most of this stuff was oral tradition. So if I have ways that I don't have to remember every word and I know that it ends in blah 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 blah, right? All I got to do is remember the first part.
And much
Right.
of Hebrew poetry was done in couplets.
Sometimes, right?
Well, you look at Psalms, it's a
It's-
lot,
it-
and Job and those type of things. But they said one thing and then they said it again, but in just a different way.
Right, but you're talking about a tremendous amount of time between. I'm not disagreeing with you, Eddie, but there could be some evolution of how even the Jewish people did that between Moses and David,
Mhm.
right?
Sure.
So there was a pretty good amount of history that happened between those two people. So there could have been a change in the way that music, just like, rock and roll. If we listen to rock and roll in the 50s and listen to it now, it don't sound like the same thing,
No.
No.
right? I mean, you can tell that, if you were just listening to the two independently and thought that they were made at the same time, you're going, this is a different genre of music than this, right? Just like we break down, Baroque period is different than
Some other period.
right, classical period, And if it was Baroque, why didn't they fix it?
Why didn't they
Right.
fix it?
That's right. So, anyways, right? So there could have been an evolution to that, but yes, there's a sing song. There is a Jewish sing song here. Now I understand that
I
if
will
we were
say
to read this in,
I missed that 12-hour versus 24-hour evening.
well, and to me, we're still
So-
in the seventh day. So how long has that been? Right? So if we're still in the seventh day, and God is essentially resting, He's not creating anymore. right? He's just intervening in history where he knows he needs to intervene, right? He knows he needs to part the Red Sea. He knows he needs to spit Jonah out of the whale. He knows that, right? He knows that I'm going to have to come down, hang on a cross, die, resurrect, right? He knows those points in history. He knows I'm going to have to go smack Paul upside the head, right?
Well, and
I'm going to have to hit,
raise up the Chaldeans, raise up the Babylonians,
Right.
the Persians, the Medes.
Well, now there again,
and-
that I don't know how much, I think that he knew that was happening. What I'm talking about are these big miraculous events that have happened. Now, if you've noticed, I haven't talked about one big miraculous event, right? But okay, so let's talk about the Red Sea, because I do believe that God parted the Red Sea, and they walked across dry land. I mean, think about it. Just parting the sea, everybody to bog down to their eyebrows. Time you march
Right.
as many people, the last people would have been swimming in mud.
Yeah.
They walked across dry land.
Mhm.
Okay, was that a miracle? Yep. Yeah. There's no way that could have happened other than God intervened. Okay, so. So I believe that God has intervened in history where He's needed to intervene. I don't believe God is moving us around like chess pieces, right?
Right. No.
I don't believe that. And there again, I believe that where God knows this is logically prior to creation. He knows that before He ever set it in motion. So He's not having to intervene except in places where He knows He has to intervene. So there again, making the day stop, with the battle with Joshua. Right.
Yeah, it stopped for 3 hours, give or
Right.
take.
Right.
Take is what it said. There
Right.
was one point that he actually turned time backwards
Right.
as
Okay.
well.
Well,
So-
Jesus walking on water, all that stuff, but the God of the universe that made this stuff established the physics, established
Sure.
all that stuff.
Yeah.
He's in command of it.
Yep.
And if he wants to counterpoint that or contra-command it, he can do it.
Sure.
And so,
Sure. There's no argument. There's no argument there.
And
God
one of the
can-
things that hasn't entered into this conversation yet about Genesis and time and that kind of stuff is, what are you going to do with death? With the length of time that the Earth is it millions of years, or is it 150,000? Is it 15,000? Is it 7,000? At what point in time did death enter the creation story?
Well, I believe we've been dying since before creation. I mean, before this creation story.
But if God created the earth and it was good, why would there be death?
Well, the good in that sense is that His will would be done. It isn't that it isn't a moral statement, right? That good is not a moral statement. It's a my will be done statement.
I don't know.
Now I'd have to go back and look at the Hebrew and read that specifically, but
But just think about
I'm
this. though.
I'm hip with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
That, if sin entered the world there with Adam and Eve, and then death came,
Mhm.
there was no one before that.
Oh, I believe that we.
Death didn't enter the scene, and if it did enter the scene, how can you reconcile that with Christ conquering death, especially in terms of man? If death was already on the scene, my mind can't reconcile those two things.
I can't compute death before the fall. It doesn't make sense.
Well, and I'm willing to discuss it and look at it, very much so.
Oh yeah,
But
for sure.
But at the same time, when you take a look at this and you look at the history of it and the deeper knowledge that you gain from this, it makes no logical sense to my mind, not speaking for anybody else, but my mind, that there was any death before death entered through Adam.
Well, I'm willing to say, okay, and I'm not going to say that I haven't thought about this before, but this to me, Eddie, is where I become real cautious when I start doing this. So when I'm applying my hermeneutics to the Bible, right, exegesis is what I always want to do. So there again, I've read other stories that talk about between 1 and 2. Now, us particular denomination and this particular Bible does not include that particular book in it, but I've read it. So how much of that story now do I need to apply to this story, right? How much of science do I need to apply to this story, right? Okay, well, how much eisegesis, right? So how much inserting am I doing when I do those kind of things? So am I inserting something into the text that doesn't need to be inside the text? Because there again, we're taking something and we're applying it from our knowledge backwards, not from the information that the writers would have at this point.
We're
right.
seeing it through Western eyes.
Well, and we're seeing it backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there again, armchair quarterback, right? We 2020 in our vision. Well, he should have thrown that pass, right? Okay, well,
not out in the flat anyway.
Yeah.
Downfield, make yard.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Okay, so
he was wide open.
right.
That
So
guy.
we're looking. What I try to do when I look at this is I try to look at it there again. When I said this morning in class, I was serious about it when I was talking to well, I don't know that we need to use names other than here, but anyways, when I was talking, when I was talking to one of my classmates, that when I said we've lost the context, we have. All that we're left with is the words, right? We don't know why Moses wrote this.
Besides, he was given it to write.
Right.
Yeah.
That he felt led by the Holy Spirit to put this down. So we don't know the context at which he was trying to say. Now there again, we can look at Paul's letters. Now there again, I hate to jump back and forth between the Old Testament and New Testament because there was a tremendous amount of time between Moses and Paul.
Right.
Okay, but we know why Paul was writing the letters because most of the times his letters tell us why he was writing the letters, whom they were written to, roughly we know the time period that they were even written.
Right.
Right. We know, for instance, we know 1 Corinthians 15 is probably creedally predates somebody writing down the gospel. So we actually have the gospel in 1 Corinthians prior to it being actually written in the gospels, right? I mean, physically somebody writing them down, right? Now the creedal part of that existed from the time Christ died and was resurrected. So we get the context of why Paul was writing that. It took us from the time the authors writing the 4 gospels until my lifetime, and actually half of my lifetime, for us to say, wait a minute, the Gospels aren't this category of literature that's by themselves. These are actually first century Greco-Roman histories. Look at all of the rest of these things, they look just like it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, okay, well, wait a minute. We thought for a long time that they were this special kind of writing that well, no, they're Greco-Roman histories. So to me, that adds more credibility to the stories themselves. So
it also adds credibility that it's superintended by the Holy Spirit.
There again, I wouldn't disagree with that.
I don't by any stretch of the means think that the Holy Spirit put his hand on that and
No,
did that.
No.
But he inspired
the people
the
to
writers,
write them.
and
Yeah.
they wrote.
Right.
He superintended it, but
But-
he didn't write it.
But there again, if we look at the Gospels and we look at the Pauline letters and even, John's letters, Peter's letters, if we look at that group of literature that we have there, we know the reason why they wrote it.
Right.
Right. Well, we don't know the reason why Moses wrote these, especially the first 11. I'd have to fall back, especially the first 11 chapters.
It's
Once we get
definitely-
into Abram and
right.
Isaac, Jacob, now we have something that more looks like a history. I would 100% agree that from that point, from verse 12 or from chapter 12 on, I keep on saying verse when I mean chapter. Chapter 12 on, I would agree. We're talking about history that Moses was trying to recapitulate historical traditions that went on. There again, Moses was writing backwards. He was writing the history backwards as somebody that had looking at it like we would write a history about World War II, right?
Okay.
Although you may have been, no, I'm just kidding.
So
I was around. I
so
missed it by that much.
so I'm going to ask. I'm going to call it the dumb question here. If we can look at chapter 12
Mhm.
and agree and verify and approve that from chapter 12 to Revelation is factual. I'm using a heavy word. I'm using it as,
Well, I'm going to challenge
as
that.
a heavy word.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge that word, but I
Just
think
because that's the only word that comes to my head too. So or even chapter 12 of Genesis through 52, 53.
yeah, whatever it is, 50 something.
There's
Well, hang on, just
In
a second.
Genesis, there's
Yeah,
50.
53.
50.
53,
50.
50.
It's straight up 50?
Straight up 50.
Yeah,
Okay.
50.
Okay,
yeah.
so
Sorry.
so
It was my number in high school.
okay, so
50.
forget my first statement from chapter 12, verse 1 to the end of chapter 50.
I would say we're looking at a history.
We can all agree that is history accounted for.
Yes.
Okay, because the break in between the end of Genesis and Exodus 1 is that 400-year time frame of Jacob.
Right.
So why would chapters 1 through 11 be any different?
Well, there
This,
again,
this is literally
Right.
I'm curious now.
well,
if-
there again,
if
you
these
beg
are
a question. There again, you beg a question that I've wondered about myself.
Why would these be any different?
Right, exactly. Why would they be? And the only reason why I can figure it is that there again, it's more polemic in nature. That it's a statement as to how we got from here to here, right? Because at the time that
Now,
Moses was
I get it's a very broad history because because as we'll all see when we get to chapter 6 and we start our flood story, in between 6:1 and 6:6, there's a lot of missing information.
sure,
And so which makes me want to agree with you.
right,
Just because of those 6 verses, there's a lot of missing information that we have in our canon. Now, there's other canonical, depending if it's the Roman Catholic or the Ethiopian,
right,
that we have those different books that explain that time frame. Primarily, it's Enoch 1.
Mhm.
Now, from my understanding, Enoch 1 wasn't written until like 300-ish BC. So it was way after the point
it would have been
of
Second Temple time frame.
exactly.
Right.
So
a document. So right.
I want to agree with you because of the gap of information we have. Now, it was left out for a reason. I don't dispute that.
Mm-hmm. I'm
curious as to what happened because it doesn't go into great detail.
Well, I think there again, part of what the apostolic fathers were doing when they were combining the books together, right? Or I mean, it wasn't like somebody sat down and went, well, what are the books of the Bible, and started throwing them together. Well, they always considered and there again, they wouldn't necessarily have considered First Enoch as Old Testament. Now it's quoted. Jude, almost half of Jude is
Enoch. Yeah.
Yeah. So there again, why wasn't it if it was so heavily quoted? But there again, like the Maccabees,
mm-hmm.
Those are left out in most Protestant Bibles simply because they don't talk to the specifics of Christ and Christ's coming.
Right.
They're more Jewish history.
Right. I mean, in one of my classes I took, I think over 60% of the context or content from my class came from First and Second Maccabee.
Right.
2 books I've never heard of.
Right. Right.
And so I was like,
right.
I know nothing about these books except what's in here. So, that's more of a Jewish history.
Right. But to answer your question, to me, there's a tonal change between 11 and 12. There's a tonal change.
Yes, for sure.
There's something different about the writing. There's something different about the writing style. Now, I don't read Hebrew. Now, I know some Hebrew words. I have study materials that allow me to look at, the Hebrew and go, okay, well, this transliterates into, bara, right? Okay, right. So that's the word for create, right? So I know some words like that. I might be able to, if I saw it written in Hebrew, be able to say, oh, there it is, But there again, when Moses was writing, there were no vowels.
Right.
When Moses, now, Second Temple, well, actually, I guess it was second or third century AD that Hebrew actually started using vowels, started using articles even. I mean, there's no articles in the Hebrew that's written. So things like the and the and a don't exist in the Hebrew, right? So anything that's put in there, the beginning, well, it didn't. It just said beginning.
Right. I mean, it says it in the beginning on verse 1. In
right,
the
but
beginning.
in the beginning,
it would have just been
the
beginning.
Beginning, right.
Okay.
Now, there again, I pointed out that there was somebody that I read, Michael Heiser, I think it is. Now that I've said it out loud, Michael Heisler, he's a doctor. He's a Hebrew scholar. And he says that, well, looking at other things, looking at other verses, looking at sentence structures, that maybe in the beginning God created isn't the way that actually should be translated. Now, I don't think that he's trying to take away from the story, right? Mm-hmm. But what he's trying to do is look at the language and say, are we getting the language right?
Right.
Is this actually what the language says? So there again, it's like, well, am I wrong? Well, I don't think it's wrong to look at this as a history because it has historical aspects to it, right? It was something that happened in the past,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's trying to teach us something. I guess where I differ, and maybe differ is the wrong word, right? I don't need something beaker, test tube, turn blue,
right?
Right, to know that it's true, or or to accept the truth claim that is coming from it. Okay, so if I look at Genesis and the first chapter and the days, my first question is what is the text trying to tell me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so me knowing what Genesis is, who wrote it, when it was written, I'm going to lean towards the edge that this isn't science, right? I'm going to lean that this is philosophical, more philosophical in nature, because they wouldn't have known that, or it would have been some hyperbolic story anyways. Now, it happens to be that we have some other examples of similar stories.
Right, which is what you talked about last week.
Yeah, and I always mispronounce it. Where is it? I wrote it down this time so I could actually. Enuma Elish. Enuma Elish. And there's some other documents that fall into that same category. That happened, at that time period. So, or around that time period. Now, I'm not saying that somebody, and please understand, I'm not saying that somebody copied something, right? But what I'm saying is if this story was out there and somebody was trying to write a counter story to it, okay, well, you had 14 gods in the, doing the universe thing. I had one.
Right. And well, that's what Paul does. And I mean, that's exactly what Paul does when he gets to there, and he gets to the Areopagus, is he goes, I see your pantheon of gods, and you have this one. Well, let me tell you about the one,
the unnamed God, which is the God.
The God,
right?
And so, I mean, that it makes sense in my head, and we're going to have to wrap up here. I mean, having this story be a descriptive history, not a factual history. Factual is the wrong word, because it is in a way factual. I'll just leave it. Having this as a descriptive history to compare, or for the Hebrew nation to have record of what they believe versus what these other cultures have wrote down and believe, it makes sense.
Okay, well let's go back to there again. What is the truth that I am being taught here? Okay, God is, well, he's Trinitarian, but he's singular. There's only one God.
Right.
He did all of this with nothing.
Mm-hmm.
He set it in plan with a purpose in mind.
Right.
He did it.
He
right?
did it.
Because actually, if you look at arguments for contingency, it's more likely that we shouldn't exist than we should exist.
Right.
Right. It's more probable. Right. So there again, okay, those are truths that I can get out of this story. So whether or not I believe that it happened in 6 contiguous 24-hour days, or whether I believe it took each day is 1,000 years, or, I mean, there's even a functionality theory, right? That this is describing the functions, right? I can't have the sky. I can't have birds without the sky. I can't have fish without the sea. I can't have plants and animals without the dirt.
Well, we'll get into that part
maybe next time.
Next week when we actually discuss the days of creation. I really enjoyed this. I really did. When the universe created the way it was, you had the sun come up first, and then all the planets were built around it. Earth was formed, the sun was created, on day 4 of creation. So there's a whole nother apple to
Well,
and
I
to
hadn't, yeah, I
and to
didn't
bite
get into that one.
So
yeah.
we'll take them in that next week. Eddie, do you have any final thoughts for today?
I don't. I think it's been good. You know, we don't. We have a consensus that this is truth,
Yes.
but we don't have a consensus about the how.
Right.
And
I don't think there will.
No,
I don't think there will ever be a consensus on the how, because we are each our own individual person. We see things in a certain way based off of our history, knowledge, and understanding.
So I will say this though. What is the important result of this? The most important result of
The
this?
most important result in my mind is that we serve Yahweh God, who created what we have, see, and experience.
Nice summary. That wasn't what I was asking for.
Hey, well, I missed that, Mark.
Well, I think that's probably the answer that I would have given.
No, I'm looking a little further down the line. I'm sorry. I may sometimes you don't ask the right question
Okay.
to get the answer.
well,
This is all part of God's unfolding plan of redemptive history that culminates in Jesus Christ, and that's where we're ultimately. That is the lens through which we look. I find this stuff fascinating, you know, and I find nothing in here that Scott and I are going to go out by the bike rack behind the school and have a fist fight about. Plus, we probably wouldn't. Either one of us would be able to make that. But there's
we get tired just going to the
just
bike
go
rack.
out there. We take a break, you know, sit down.
But no, I mean, yeah, that's where I think we're supposed to be as Christians, and I think that's one of the things that I like about the title of this podcast, right? Because there were Greeks that sat around, you know, on whatever it was that they were sitting on there in the Areopagus, and they were having discussions, and they always didn't walk away agreeing with one another, but they always came back and had the discussion the next time that they were going to do it.
Exactly.
Right? And you didn't hear about any knife fights going on at the Areopagus. They waited until at Tuber. At Tuber.
The pretty steep hill, they could roll down, and if they threw the body down, they could roll. But I wonder what kind of food service they had up there, and all that kind of stuff. But this is good. It's healthy. It's sharp.
Yeah.
It is iron, sharpening iron, and you make me think, which I appreciate. You know,
one thing I'm going to look at for sure this week, if my wonderful Toddlersaurus Rex allows me to, I am going to dig more into the phrase used, there was evening and there was morning, the whichever day, because I knew the Jewish and Hebrew people, it was evening to evening. That's the way they counted their days. I completely overlooked the evening to morning was the first day. So now I'm curious about that, and I'm going to see what I can find on Logos. That's the search I use.
Actually, that's a Bible software I use too.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and dig into that, see if there's any information on there, because now, you know, my brain's going, because I've overlooked that completely. Missed that part. My brain was auto-filling to the Jewish and Hebrew day.
Right. Now, there again, this wasn't always the way that I was thinking and looking at things. But there again, when I learned a lot about the oral traditions that go on, because there's a lot of oral traditions that we've had in here, and some people claim that oral traditions aren't as good as written traditions, and I vehemently disagree with that.
There was oral long before there was written. I mean,
Right.
that's just what it was.
Right, but there again, that when you study those kind of things, you see patterns like that that are used in there. Now, there again, it's an idiom. I mean, I can tell you what it is. It's an idiom that the Hebrews used to describe the day, right? So it's an idiom. But there again, if it's an idiom, that even infers that it's hyperbolic and it's, it's not literal in its sense, right? I'm using, like me saying cool and cat, right?
Mhm.
Those are idioms, right? Most people would say it's idiotic, but whatever.
That thought crossed my mind.
Well,
Now,
we need to.
But yeah, next week, I've got some stuff in my mind that I'm thinking I need to be reading this week,
Mm-hmm.
and
I don't want to look like the bad guy. And all
No,
this
Oh,
stuff.
no.
This is exactly what I wanted when I bit the bullet and was like, okay, it's time to go to Genesis. This is exactly what I was looking for and hoping for, is because if we all sat around and had the exact same ideas and thoughts and whatever,
This would be boring.
this would be boring. The whole thing, in theory, the whole podcast would be boring.
Right.
But
there again, we don't get the iron sharpening iron, right?
exactly. So, well, I have some studying to do. Eddie, it looks like you're going to be doing some studying.
I will be looking at
this
stuff,
week.
plus prep for Sunday school, and
Mhm.
so my week has got stuff to it, and I got to mow the yard this week. So.
You got to mow the yard. Okay. So for everyone out there, next week, day one of creation,
Part 2.
part 2. Guys, I thank them and y'all again for being here. Next week we will have our big timer on the table, so we will all be able to
All right,
keep
cool.
track. I said we needed to wrap it up about 15 minutes ago, so I'm gonna let y'all go. Thank them and y'all for and watching, and we'll see y'all next week.